Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here. Welcome back to the channel. In this episode, we are going to have a look at this new version of the Tamron 28-75 f2.8 G2 lens. It's a new version of the really popular Tamron 28-75 f2.8 with improvements in many areas. So let's get started, as there are lots of things I want to talk about and lots of test results I want to share with you as well. But before we start, if you are a regular viewer of this channel, I have made one change on how I film this video. If you notice it, please let me know and tell me what you think it is and whether you think it is better or not. Actually, even if you don't really see any changes, please also drop a comment below, because I would love to know how many people actually notice the difference. If you are familiar with the original version of the Tamron 28-75 f2.8 lens, the new version is very similar in a lot of ways. It is still a very compact f2.8 full-frame zoom lens. The size of this G2 is virtually identical to the original version when you are at 28mm anyway, and when you zoom in the lens to 75mm, both of these lenses would extend, but with the G2 it extends a little bit less than the original version. It remains a very lightweight lens and the weight is only 540 grams, which is even slightly lighter than the original version. The original version of the Tamron 28-75 is a very nice lens, but it does feel a bit plasticky. This new G2 version has similar build quality, but it feels less plasticky. I think it's partly because the coating on the body, it feels better, it's not as slippery, and there are also a few small design changes. For example, both the focus ring and the zoom ring, they extrude slightly, so when you hold it, it just feels a little bit better in your hand. And also the zoom ring, the new version feel a little bit better dampened, and also the resistance feel more consistent when you are going through the different focal length. All this together make this G2 version look and feel a little bit more premium than the original version. The supplied lens hood has a similar shape compared to the one that comes with the original version, but it is a little bit deeper and also has a slightly different outside coating. This Tamron 28-75 G2 lens has a completely new optics design. 17 elements in 15 groups, so even more elements than the original version. We will see whether it means the lens has better image quality or not very soon. And despite there is a USB-C port on the side of the body here and the port is completely open, Tamron say the lens still has a moisture resistant construction. In other words, it is a weatherproof lens. There is also a new button on the lens here, which the original version doesn't have. Tamron called it the focus set button. By default, the button behaves the same way as the focus hold button on the Sony lenses. You can assign it to trigger one of the features from the camera's manual system. However, using the new Tamron lens utility software, you can do a lot more. With this new Tamron 28-75 G2 lens and also the new Tamron 30-150 lens, Tamron has released a new lens utility software which allows you to do a number of customization with these new Tamron lenses. You can customize the focus set button to one of the 4 additional features. You can use the button to switch between autofocus and manual focus mode, or you can store a particular focus distance and quickly switch to that. For example, if you are a sports photographer and there's a certain focus distance you want to quickly switch to when shooting some sports event, this would be really handy. Or if you are a landscape photographer or an astrophotographer, you can also use this feature to preset the perfect focus distance that you would usually use when you are taking photos. Or you can set your A-B focus point. You can preset 2 different focus distance A and B by long pressing the button, and then if you press the button again, the focus will switch from A to B or vice versa. And if you are viewing video, you can also adjust the focus transition speed. Otherwise, you can use the button to change the focus ring to become an aperture ring or back to a focus ring again. Apart from that, you can also customize the focus ring a bit more as well. You can adjust the focus ring rotation direction. So for example, if most of your lenses have a reverse focus rotation direction, you can customize that for this Tamron lens. You can also set the manual focus mode to either linear or non-linear mode. I imagine these are features that videographers would really appreciate. And you can upgrade the lens firmware using this lens utility as well. The best thing about this software is that you do not need to buy any special hardware to use it. You don't have to buy a USB dock or anything like that. Just use a normal USB cable to directly connect your computer to the USB-C port on the lens, and that's all you need to do. Since we are still in a lockdown here in New Zealand right now, and I only have access to a Sony A063 for this review, so I'm not going to do too much autofocus testing, but autofocus appears to be quite fast and also very quiet even with the Sony A063. This Tamron 28-75 f2.8 G2 has a minimum focus distance of 0.18 meter at the wide end, and that would give us the maximum magnification ratio of 0.37 times. That sounds really good for a non-macro lens, but remember the original 28-75 lens can also focus very close. It can focus as close as 0.19 meter, also at the wide end, and that will give us the maximum magnification, which is slightly lower but still very decent at 0.34 times. Now, while the difference in numbers may not sound like a big difference, but check out these two photos, both shot at the minimum focus distance. The G2 does allow you to capture a photo with a noticeably higher magnification ratio. However, since with both of these lenses, the maximum magnification ratio are achieved at the wide end, that means the front element of the lens get really close to your subject. That means you could cast shadow on the subject quite easily. Okay, now let's have a look at the image quality, and let's have a look at the wide angle and 28mm focal length first. If you look at the center of the image, both lenses are very sharp at the maximum aperture already. The G2 may be marginally sharper, but really both lenses are good enough at wide open. The difference is really not gonna be noticeable unless you are shooting with a A7R4 or something that has a really high resolution sensor. The corner of the G2 at 28mm focal length is also really sharp at f2.8. When stopping down the lens to f4 and f5.6, I see very little difference in terms of corner sharpness. If I compare it with the original version, the G2 is definitely much sharper at the corner. With the original version, stopping down the lens to f4 and even f5.6, the corners still look slightly soft. I have to stop down to f8, then the corner sharpness of the original version is now similar to the G2 at f2.8. So G2's corner at 28mm is really good. And now let's have a look at 75mm focal length, the telephoto end. If we look at the center, the G2 is very sharp at the maximum aperture. This is the same for the original version too. So with both these two lenses, stopping down would only give you very marginal improvement in terms of center sharpness. And now let's have a look at the corner. With the G2 lens, while the corner at f2.8 is not as sharp as the center, it is still pretty decent. And if you stop down the lens, there is some small graduate improvement in the corner sharpness. Compare the G2 with the original version, the G2 is still sharper, but the difference is not as dramatic as the wide angle end. The original version has some minor glow effect, which the G2 doesn't have. The bokeh from the G2 looks alright. It is certainly not the smoothest or the most dreamy bokeh that I have ever seen, but at the same time it is not super nervous as well. When zoom into the bokeh balls, I can quite often see some kind of patterns instead of perfectly smooth bokeh. This also happens on the original version, which is even more obvious than the G2. There is also a bit of bokeh creeping at the corner at the maximum aperture. If you don't want to have that, you will need to stop down the lens to around f5.6, and this is pretty much the same for both the G2 and the original version. With the vignetting correction disabled, vignetting is very noticeable at f2.8 with the G2 lens at both the wide and telephoto end. Stopping down the lens to f4 would improve it quite a lot, and at f5.6 then vignetting is not really noticeable. Compared with the original version, the G2 appears to have slightly more vignetting at the wide end, while the original version has a little bit more vignetting at the telephoto end. This is most noticeable at f2.8, as once we stop down the lens to f4, both lenses has a lot less vignetting, so the difference is not really that noticeable anymore, even if I put the test photos side by side. One more interesting thing is, all these vignetting test photos were shot with the same white balance setting, but you can see the captured color is slightly different. Both these lenses have very decent chromatic aberration control. In most of my real-world photos that were shot with the G2, I see very minimal amount of color fringing. Even the really challenging high contrast photo, the amount of color fringing is still at a pretty low level. And if you look at this photo, check the high contrast area, I almost can't see any color fringing at all. But if you look at the area that is just under the window, the original version has a little bit more chromatic aberration while the G2 doesn't have that. So overall, I think both lenses are very good, but the G2 is slightly better. Both lenses has built-in lens profile to support distortion correction, which would give you minimal amount of distortion once you have enabled it. But what about if I disable the distortion correction? With the distortion correction disabled, both lenses start with a bit of barrel distortion at the wide angle end, and then as you zoom in, the distortion slowly turns into pin cushion distortion, and it is quite noticeable once you reach the telephoto and 75mm focal length. Comparing these two lenses, the G2 has more noticeable distortion than the original version. But yeah, as I said, you could enable the in-camera distortion control to minimize distortion. In terms of lens flare, both lenses are okay. What I mean is, when shooting into a strong light source, I do see a bit of lens flare from both lenses. The lens flare and ghosting are usually kept at reasonable level, but appearance is a little bit different. For example, the G2 lens would sometimes render a purple color ghosting, while the original version would have a really bright dot. So I feel overall they are quite similar. However, when I check some of my comparison photos where the camera is locked on a tripod, so that means the comparison photos were shot from the exact same location, most of the time the photo that were shot with the original version does have a little bit more lens flare compared to the G2 version, no matter I was shooting at wide open or the minimum aperture. With the Tamron 28-75 G2 lens, when stopped down to f11, we can see some Sunstars in the photo, and when we stop down to minimum aperture f22, Sunstars become very sharp and clean. With the original version, stopping down the lens to f11, also we can start to see some Sunstars, but the Sunstars have a fan-shaped tail, which I personally don't really like. Even when stopped down to minimum aperture f22, the Sunstars still doesn't look quite as clean as the Sunstars from the G2. As I've mentioned before, since I'm only using a A063 for this review, so I didn't do too much autofocus tests. But what about focus breathing? Here is a comparison that I shot at 35mm focal length at f4. Focus changed from 1 meter to about 20 meter, then back to 1 meter. Both lenses show quite small amount of focus briefing, but the new G2 lens appear to have a little bit less focus briefing than the original version. After doing all this testing and also a bit of real-world shooting, I think it is quite obvious this new Tamron 28-75 2.8 G2 lens is a better lens than the original version. The lens feels a bit more premium, image quality is better in almost every single area, and then we have the new customizable button, USB port on the lens, and also the new lens utility software together. They just make this new lens a lot more customizable for both photographer and videographer. But I guess the best thing is Tamron managed to do all this without having to increase the size, the weight, or the price of this new lens, which are the things that make the original version so successful. So if you are looking at buying a f2.8 zoom lens for your Sony camera, this new version Tamron 28-75 f2.8 G2 lens is not only better but also offer better value for money than the original version as well. If you got any questions about this lens, just drop a comment below. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next video.